There was nothing out of place about Charles Benton that morning. His suit was pressed dark and understated. The collar of his shirt sat neat against his neck. He moved through Terminal 4 at JFK with the quiet purpose of a man who'd caught more than his share of early flights in late-night meetings. In his left hand, he carried a well-worn leather garment bag. In his right, a first-class boarding pass bound for San Francisco. Charles was heading west to deliver the keynote at the Western Produce Sustainability Summit. At 58, he was no stranger to these kinds of trips. This wasn't about status for him. He preferred efficiency, privacy. He was the kind of man who let his work speak for itself. But as he approached Gate 17, something in the air shifted. The boarding line hadn't formed yet. A few folks stood nearby, some sipping coffee, others lost in their phones. Charles walked up to the desk and offered a quiet nod to the young woman behind the counter. Her name tag read Haley. He handed her his pass. She looked at it, then at him, then again slower this time. Her expression didn't say welcome aboard. It said, wait a minute, this line is for premium passengers only. She told him, her voice sharper than it needed to be. Charles nodded. Yes, I know. She blinked, hesitated, then finally scanned the boarding pass but stopped short of completing the process. Instead, she turned to whisper to a nearby colleague. The second woman peeked over trying to get a better look. Charles didn't react. He didn't fidget, didn't speak. I'm going to need to see some ID, Haley said suddenly. Charles tilted his head, calm but curious. You don't usually ask for ID at the gate. Is something wrong? No, she replied quickly. It's just a security thing. But there was no policy for that, and they both knew it. He handed her his license anyway. She took it awkwardly, as if unsure what to do with it. Then, without saying much more, she stepped away and flagged down a man in a security uniform. Charles had seen this happen before, not often, but enough to recognize the signs. He wasn't being questioned because something was out of order. He was being questioned because someone had decided he didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. And as the uniformed man began walking his way, Charles quietly reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made one call. Just one. And that was enough to change everything. Charles Benton didn't raise his voice. He didn't scowl or gesture or even sigh. He simply stepped away from the gate, calm and deliberate, and made his phone call. Maggie, he said softly, I need you to pull up the catering contract we signed with Horizon Air, the one covering their western routes. Yeah, I'm standing at JFK Gate 17. I'll hold. He stood still, phone pressed to his ear, watching the boarding desk like someone waiting for an elevator that had forgotten his floor. Back near the counter, Haley leaned into the microphone and spoke to the small cluster of passengers who were now beginning to gather behind him. We're just sorting out a small issue, she said, smiling tight. Thank you for your patience, but there was no real patience. A businessman in a gray pullover leaned toward another and whispered, is he causing some kind of trouble? Charles heard it. He didn't turn. Maggie's voice came back through the phone, steady and crisp. Got it? You want me to call corporate? No, he said. Just flag it. I think they're about to recognize a problem. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. His boarding pass was still in his hand, untouched. But that call wasn't about making a fuss. It was a warning. Charles Benton wasn't always the man with a tailored suit and a first-class ticket. He'd come a long road from Mansfield, Ohio, a small city with quiet streets and homes that carried the scent of breakfast early in the morning and tired footsteps at night. He grew up in a modest house with soft, worn floorboards and a kitchen that always smelled like onions and fried potatoes. His mother, Ethel, worked the produce section at a local grocery store. His father, Leonard, pulled long shifts at the steel mill and picked up car repair work on weekends. They didn't have much, but they always had enough. And more importantly, they had pride. Pride in work, pride in honesty, pride in the way you carried yourself in the world. Charles learned those lessons early. By the time he was 15, he was getting up at 5 every Saturday to help his mother unload and sort crates of fruits and vegetables before the store opened. She showed him how to tell a good melon by the way it felt in his hands, how to spot a bruised apple from across the room, and most importantly, how to talk to people with respect. Talk to them, she'd say, not at them. That difference stuck with him. By 23, Charles had a degree in agricultural business from Kent State, a worn briefcase, and exactly 330 in saving. His first venture wasn't glamorous. It was a produce stand by the side of a county road outside Columbus. No employees, no help, just a borrowed pickup truck, a pop-up tent, and a few crates of sweet corn and tomatoes. He sold that corn like it was the last harvest before winter. Friendly, reliable, and always ready with a clean box and change in hand. But the real change came in his 30s. That's when he noticed something no one else seemed to be looking at: a gap between small, sustainable farms and large grocery chains. Most markets couldn't figure out how to source local produce at scale. The big guys wanted volume and consistency. The small farms had quality, but couldn't meet demand or couldn't meet it fast enough. Charles saw the space between the two and stepped into it. He started working directly with regional farms across the Midwest, building trust, establishing routes, and figuring out how to get fresh food from dirt to display in record time without sacrificing quality. Not boutique produce, not farmers market novelties, just clean, well-grown, affordable food delivered with care. His company, Benton Foods, started in a rented garage with a folding desk and a laptop that crashed twice a week. For years, he drove the routes himself, shaking hands and fixing breakdowns with duct tape and faith. 15 years later, Benton Foods was supplying over 30 high-end grocery chains, 5 university systems, and most recently, Horizon Air. The airline had reached out to him. After a string of bad press and dismal food reviews, they were desperate for a fresh start. Charles didn't pitch. He listened. And when he spoke, he laid out a plan that impressed the executives in the room: seasonal produce rotations, direct farm-to-air sourcing, and eco-friendly packaging that would cut waste in half. It wasn't just about the food. It was about rebuilding trust in what people were served. They signed a $48 million contract without a second guess. And yet here he was, standing off to the side at Gate 17, treated like a security risk for having the audacity to be called black and dressed too well. But Charles never lost sight of where he came from. His office in Dayton wasn't filled with awards or accolades. If you walked in, you'd see a framed photo of that old produce stand and a wall covered in handwritten thank you notes from farmers. Maggie, his assistant, handled the logistics. Charles handled the people. He didn't crave attention. He never boasted about power. He believed in quiet strength, in doing things right, and in offering people a chance to correct themselves before making things worse. So when the gate agent at JFK ignored the name printed on his boarding pass and instead scanned his face, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a reminder. A reminder that even after a lifetime of doing things right, some people only see what they expect to see, and if you don't fit that image, they start reaching for reasons. Charles Benton wasn't there to make a scene, but he wasn't going to disappear either. That call he made, it was a gentle knock on the doors above an invitation for someone higher up to step in and ask the question that Haley never thought to ask. Who is this man we're treating like a problem? And by the time someone did ask that question, it was already too late to unring the bell. Haley stood behind the counter, fidgeting with her headset cord. The tension around Gate 17 had shifted, no longer a quiet delay, but something more unsettled. The first-class lane was thinning and a few passengers were beginning to murmur. People were growing impatient, stealing glances at Charles Benton as he stood silently to the side, his boarding pass still in hand, unmoved. He wasn't flustered, wasn't checking his watch, just waiting. But inside, Charles recognized the pattern. He had lived this moment before in quieter ways and sharper ones. It always began the same: someone looked at him and saw something that didn't sit right. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because they couldn't imagine a man like him in the seat he paid for. Haley leaned into her mic and muttered, "I need backup at Gate 17. Her voice cracked slightly. She didn't realize Mia, her colleague, had been watching from just a few feet away. Mia leaned in. Is there actually an issue, she asked under her breath. Haley shifted eyes still fixed on her screen. He says he's first class. Mia raised an eyebrow. Well, his past says he is. What's the problem? Haley frowned. It just doesn't feel right. Mia didn't say anything, but her posture changed slightly. Not a confrontation, just a warning. A subtle message, be careful. But Haley didn't catch it. She was too focused on pretending to scroll through a reservation note that didn't exist. The security officer still standing nearby hadn't offered a word of explanation. Just crossed arms, eyes flicking over Charles every few seconds, as if waiting for the moment something might justify his presence. Charles remained composed. Years of conditioning had taught him that staying still was sometimes the most powerful act. Then his phone buzzed. He stepped a few feet farther from the boarding lane to answer. Maggie, her voice came steady as ever. I've already flagged the contract. Sent an alert to their regional VP and looped in Jack Renault. He's their head of food service integration. Thank you, Charles said quietly. Keep me posted. He hung up, eyes still calm as if nothing had happened, but things were happening, just not where the eye could see. Back at the desk, Mia leaned toward Haley again. Do you even know who that is? She whispered. Haley gave her a blank look. That's Charles Benton, Mia said. I saw his company on our vendor list last week. They're the ones we just signed for the produce overhaul. Haley's stomach flipped. Wait, what? He owns Benton Foods, Mia whispered. We're working with them now. Haley's mouth went dry. She looked at Charles, who still hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't asked for anything more than what was already his. Mia offered gently, maybe we should just board him now. Haley panicked. No, if we do it now, it'll look like she was cut off by a voice crackling through her earpiece. Haley, I need a status on the hold at gate 17, a supervisor said. We're showing a delay flag. What's going on? Haley stiffened. Just handling a passenger issue. It's under control. The supervisor didn't sound convinced. Make sure it is. We've got execs flying in this morning. No surprises. She looked back at Charles again. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the tarmac, hands folded behind his back, like a man waiting on time itself. To Haley, he suddenly seemed larger than the gate, the delay, the awkward silence. She wasn't managing the situation anymore. She was the situation. And across the airport, 10 stories up, in a corner office overlooking the runways, Cynthia Reyes was putting down a croissant when her assistant walked in with a phone. It's flagged urgent, she said, handing it over. Cynthia answered briskly. This is Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. Maggie Geller calling on behalf of Charles Benton, CEO of Benton Foods. Cynthia straightened in her seat. There's an incident involving Mr. Benton at gate 17, Maggie said, voice measured. He's being denied boarding despite a confirmed first-class ticket. We're hoping it won't escalate. Cynthia didn't need the details. She knew who Charles was. Horizon had just signed with his company to lead the entire in-flight food revamp. His name had been in every executive memo for the last month. This wasn't just bad service. It was a spark in a dry field. I'll handle it, she said sharply, already grabbing her jacket. Back at Horizon's Minneapolis headquarters, Jack Renault's phone buzzed during a lunch meeting. He answered, heard Maggie's voice, and nearly dropped his fork. You've got to be kidding, he said. Nope, Charles called it in himself, Maggie replied. He's standing there, calm but waiting. Jack stood up, already dialing another number. I'll get Cynthia. You might want to prep legal. Already on it. And just like that, what began as a gut assumption at gate 17 had become a boardroom-level scramble. Down at the terminal, passengers were shifting. Phones were out. People were checking flight apps, refreshing their screens. And then, like a slow-moving wave, two figures appeared at the gate. One was a man in a Navy suit with a Horizon Air badge. The other, a woman in red heels, was still on her phone as she walked Cynthia Reyes. She ended her call as she approached. Charles turned slightly, but didn't step forward. Mr. Benton, she said, offering her hand. I'm Cynthia Reyes, Executive Director of Regional Operations. May I speak with you privately? Charles nodded. Of course, they stepped a few feet away. Behind them, Haley stood frozen, clutching her badge like a lifeline. Cynthia took a breath. Mr. Benton, on behalf of Horizon Air, I want to apologize. This never should have happened. I've contacted our internal team. We're investigating. Charles was silent for a moment. Then, do you know what seat I was assigned? She glanced at her tablet. Seat 1A. He smiled faintly. First row. Interesting. I was told this lane was for premium passengers only. Cynthia met his eyes. Again, I apologize. Charles leaned in just slightly. The issue isn't the mistake, Miss Reyes. It's the assumption behind it. She swallowed hard. Understood. But Charles wasn't looking for a soundbite. He was waiting to see if she understood something deeper. Behind the counter, Haley looked pale. Mia had stopped looking at her entirely. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was revealing, and it was only just beginning. Back at the gate, the atmosphere had thickened. Passengers were still waiting, but now their murmurs had turned into low conversations. The man in khakis near the front of the first-class lane glanced at his watch, then back at the counter. What's going on with the holdup, he asked, but no one answered. Haley didn't look up. Her voice, which had earlier cut so confidently through the room, had vanished. Charles Benton had stepped forward, not toward the boarding desk, but toward the wide glass wall that overlooked the runway. He stood there quietly, hands clasped behind his back, watching as luggage carts traced slow arcs across the tarmac. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't pressing. He was waiting on something larger than any of them understood. Haley, still rooted behind the counter, was sweating now. Mia stood beside her in silence, no longer trying to explain or intervene. She didn't need to. Everyone at Gate 17 could feel what was happening. A shift. The air had changed. And far above in the upper levels of the terminal, Cynthia Reyes had just stepped into a secure conference room, her heels echoing on the tile. She'd left Charles with a respectful nod, but she hadn't returned to her office. Instead, she walked straight into crisis mode. She was already on the phone with Horizon's legal department and corporate HR. I want full logs, she said. Gate recording staff notes, call records. Everyone who interacted with Mr. Benton today and earlier this week. No delays, no edits, full transparency. The directive was clear. Before this story could spiral into something uncontainable, it needed to be understood, documented, and dealt with thoroughly and fast. Across the country, in a Minneapolis office lined with framed strategy maps and regional performance charts, Jack Renault, Horizon's head of food service integration, was reading Maggie's follow-up email. He scanned it once, then again slower this time. Detained at the gate, no explanation. Flight delayed, Benton standing by, calm, waiting. Jack dropped his sandwich back into its wrapper. The upcoming campaign launch. The rebranding efforts, the Fall Fresh Flight Initiative, all of it was built around the work Charles Benton had done for them. His face was even scheduled to appear in a highlight video introducing Horizon's new food partners. And now that face had been told in so many words, you don't belong. At Gate 17, Charles remained still. It was the same steadiness he'd once held as a young man standing behind a folding table stacked with peaches and squash off Highway 33. His stillness wasn't stubbornness, it was experience. He had learned a long time ago that there were moments in life when standing still spoke louder than any outburst. Down the jet bridge, the flight crew had been briefed. The cabin door remained open, but boarding had stopped completely. The terminal boards flickered quietly, but more than one Horizon departure now read delayed, internal coordination. Passengers were looking around, but no one could quite name what they were feeling. Discomfort, confusion, guilt maybe. Then from the concourse, two more people arrived, one in a dark blazer, the other wearing a legal department lanyard. Justin Cole, Horizon's East Coast legal liaison, approached Charles with practiced care. Mr. Benton, he said, offering a hand, I want to apologize personally. I understand this experience has been. Charles raised a hand, gently cutting him off. I don't need an apology, Mr. Cole, he said. I need to understand how this happens. After we sign a $48 million contract, how is this still happening? Justin hesitated. There was no safe answer, no statement that would wash it away. Cynthia stepped forward. Mr. Benton, we recognize the weight of this. We've already initiated a review of gate conduct and sensitivity training protocols. But I want you to know this isn't who we are. Charles's brow lifted slightly. Do you mean it's not the company's values? Or that it's not a reflection of the gate agent's judgment? The pause that followed said everything. He gestured subtly toward Haley, who stood a few feet away, clutching her badge with both hands, eyes cast down. She saw a well-dressed black man with a premium ticket and assumed I was in the wrong line, Charles said softly. Not once, repeatedly. She called security the moment I asked a question. You don't need to explain to me what that's about. I've lived it. Justin shifted, clearly uncomfortable. We're prepared to issue a formal apology, Mr. Benton, publicly or privately, as you prefer. Charles reached into his garment bag and pulled out a folder. He opened it, handed over a single document. This is the signed contract, he said. My company now supplies every fresh item on your Western and Midwest routes. That includes the produce you serve in your premium lounges, by the way. He let that settle. So when I say the person being blocked at the gate is your brand, I mean that literally. He wasn't angry, he wasn't raising his voice, but in that moment, every person at gate 17 knew that something had shifted. I don't want a tweet, Charles said quietly. I don't want a letter. I want better. Because the next time someone like me gets treated like a threat for doing absolutely nothing, they may not have a direct line to your VP. Silence. Across the gate, a woman near the business class queue was holding her phone at waist level, not pretending anymore. She was recording. Justin cleared his throat. We'll initiate an immediate review. We'll make personnel changes where needed. You have my word. Charles looked at his watch. Good. Then we can all go about our day. Cynthia stepped forward to escort him toward the plane. Before boarding, Charles turned slightly toward Haley. He didn't speak. He didn't glare. He just looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, with disappointment. And then he stepped onto the jet bridge. Behind him, Mia leaned close to Haley and said low and firm, You don't get it. That man's company puts food on half the trays we serve up front. Haley didn't respond. She simply stared ahead as the weight of it all began to settle in. But the real impact wasn't in that last exchange. It was in what came next. As Charles Benton stepped onto the plane, the tone inside the cabin shifted. There was no applause, no overt show of awareness. Just a hush, the kind that says, we know, even if no one quite knew what to say. The flight attendant at the door, a young man named Jordan, straightened up as Charles approached. Mr. Benton, he said quietly, may I take your garment bag? Charles gave a small nod, handed it over without a word. Another attendant appeared with a bottle of water uncapped. She didn't ask, just offered it with both hands. If there's anything you need before takeoff, Jordan added in a voice just above a whisper, just say the word. Charles didn't reply right away. He simply took his seat, placed the water on the tray table and exhaled slowly. Not relief, just control, just breath. Out the window, the tarmac shimmered in the late morning light. But inside the plane, time had slowed to something still and uncertain. The gate remained closed. The captain hadn't yet made an announcement. Overhead bins were shut. Passengers settled into seats, but no one quite relaxed. Because outside, something was happening. Terminal boards began to update. First, Gate 17's flight flipped from boarding to delayed. Operational review. Then Gate 18 followed. Then two more nearby. No explanations, just vague language system check, internal processing, crew coordination. The truth was simpler. Horizon Air had issued what they called a soft shutdown, a quiet freeze on departures, no alarms, just time bought in silence to assess what had unfolded. In a conference room behind the terminal, Cynthia Reyes sat at the head of a narrow table. On her laptop were gate logs, internal staff messages, and audio pulled from Haley's headset recordings. It was all there. There had been no threat, no disturbance, no policy breach by the passenger. Only a call made to security by a gate agent who had never been at risk, only uncomfortable. It was enough. Cynthia leaned back in her chair, her face drawn. I want Haley off the floor before this plane leaves the ground. Quietly, no statements, just off schedule. Her team nodded. Back on board, Charles closed his eyes. Not to rest, but to think. He thought about his father, Leonard, how once back in the 80s, he'd taken off work early to shop for a used car. Charles had gone with him. They were both dressed in their Sunday clothes just to make a good impression. But the salesman wouldn't even unlock the driver's side door. Said something like, "That model's a little out of your range, gentlemen." Leonard had smiled, thanked him politely, and they'd left. But Charles remembered the quiet in the car ride home. How loud silence could feel when dignity got bruised. He also remembered a business pitch in his 20s, his first shot at a real investment. He walked in, early briefcase in hand, only to have the receptionist hand him a valet ticket. "I'll let them know you parked the client's car," she said. And now, after all these years, the same doubt still lingered, just dressed up differently. Jordan returned, crouched slightly beside Charles's seat. "Mr. Benton," he said gently, "we've been asked to delay departure briefly. Some coordination issue with the terminal. We'll keep you posted." Charles nodded once. Jordan hesitated, then added quietly, "I saw what happened back there. It wasn't right." Charles opened his eyes, met the young man's gaze. "Thank you," he said. Jordan stood there a moment longer. Then, with the kind of sincerity that doesn't need rehearsing, he said, "I told my younger brother to watch your talk at last year's Sustainability Summit. He's studying agrisons. You made it feel real for him. Just thought you should know." Charles's expression softened for the first time in hours. A small smile, not polite, not performative, just human. "I appreciate that," he said. Jordan nodded, then slipped away down the aisle. Up front, the cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out and whispered to the lead attendant. Their words weren't meant to carry, but Charles caught part of it. "Still on ground hold. No timeline." Somewhere in the back, a passenger let out a frustrated sigh. "Figures," the man muttered. "This airline never gets it together." Charles didn't respond. He turned his face back to the window where a thin cloud passed low over the tarmac. He had done what he came to do. Now the rest was out of his hands. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Slowly, quietly, the wheels behind the scenes began to turn. At Cynthia's desk, the final internal report landed. Clean boarding pass, no alerts, no disturbance filed. Just one notable event, a call to security placed without documented cause. That was enough. And by the time Charles's flight finally pulled back from the gate, Haley had been removed from duty. No announcement, no confrontation, just gone. Later that afternoon, a photo surfaced on a niche travel blog. A grainy image taken from across the terminal, a well-dressed black man standing calmly at a gate phone to his ear, eyes steady. The caption read, "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move." But the whole airport listened. The story didn't explode. It didn't go viral, but it lingered. And that made all the difference. The plane touched down in San Francisco just after 1:15 p.m. local time. Charles Benton waited. As the other passengers gathered their bags and rushed toward rideshares meetings and connecting gates, he sat still. No hurry, no chatter. His garment bag now rested on his lap, the unopened bottle of water still beside him. Only when the aisle cleared did he rise, thanking the flight crew with a quiet nod before stepping off the aircraft. Outside, the air was warmer than back in New York. The sun had found its way between the clouds, and the streets near the airport moved with the usual California rhythm, calm on the surface, pulsing underneath. Charles slid into the back seat of a black Lincoln sedan and opened his phone for the first time since takeoff. Messages flooded the screen. A text from Maggie Legal has sent over a draft letter. They want to know if you'd prefer a statement or an internal follow-up. Also, your photos circulating. Then a link to a local news blog. A small piece buried below headlines but written with care. Boarding delay raises questions at JFK Horizon vendor, mistaken for unqualified passenger. Charles read it once, then let the phone go dark. At the hotel, the Western Produce Sustainability Summit was already underway. Inside the grand ballroom, attendees mingled near colorful displays of seasonal fruits in compostable packaging prototypes. Suppliers swapped stories, researchers shared notes, and company reps passed out samples with polished smiles. Charles entered without ceremony. A few heads turned, then did double takes. He shook hands with two colleagues from the Midwest Growers Association. A woman from the University of Oregon gave him a warm nod. No one asked about the flight. No one mentioned the gate. Just business, the way he liked it. He made his way to the side of the stage as the MC wrapped up a session on soil reclamation. When his name was announced, he stepped forward slowly. No fanfare, no music, just presence. The applause was polite, professional. But as he looked out across the room, hundreds of people from small family farms to billion-dollar distributors, there was a kind of attentiveness that couldn't be taught. Charles didn't mention JFK, not once. Instead, he spoke of food. He spoke of resilience in the supply chain, of how one missed email nearly cost a beet farmer in Kansas his entire harvest, and how that failure led to a change in his company's communication protocols. He talked about transportation inefficiencies, spoiled pallets, and the weight of small decisions. But near the end, he paused. He scanned the room, let the stillness settle. Then he said, "Sometimes the problem isn't the system." The room quieted even more. Sometimes it's the shortcuts we take in reading people. He didn't need to say more. The message was already working its way through. Whether it's a new grower, he continued, a logistics partner, or someone standing in a line with a valid boarding pass, what we assume about others tells the world more about us than it does about them. That was all. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was thoughtful, the kind that comes from people who'd just seen something, felt something they weren't expecting. As Charles walked off the stage, a man from a Seattle distribution firm caught up with him. That line he said about shortcuts hit harder than I thought it would. Charles gave a quiet smile. That's where the rot starts, in the shortcuts. The man nodded. Yeah, it does. Back in New York, Cynthia Reyes sat in her office reviewing the final report from the internal audit. Haley's file had been flagged. The records were clear. The call to security had no justification. But Charles hadn't asked for her to be fired, hadn't asked for compensation, hadn't even responded to the draft apology. He didn't need to. Everyone in the chain of command understood exactly what had happened and how close they'd come to losing far more than a contract. In the following weeks, Horizon quietly announced a new partnership with a civil rights advisory group focused on workplace sensitivity and bias prevention. A few small press outlets connected the dots. Charles's name wasn't mentioned outright, but a Horizon spokesperson issued a statement. Recent events have reminded us of the work still to be done. Charles didn't comment, didn't post, didn't retweet. He went back to work. And when Maggie asked if he wanted to sit for an interview with GQ, he simply said, "Tell them I'm busy feeding people." Weeks passed, then months. But the story didn't fade, it lingered. Not because it exploded on social media, but because people remembered it. Travelers who were in the terminal that morning told the story over dinner tables. Executives shared the image of Charles standing silently by the glass wall during leadership retreats. And somewhere deep in Horizon Air's break rooms, gate agents began pausing, thinking twice, asking themselves whether they truly saw the person in front of them or just their own reflection of what they thought belonged. And far from JFK, in a small kitchen in Mansfield, Ohio, a retired grocery clerk named Ethel Benton read a quiet article online, saw the photo of her son, and smiled to herself. "That's my boy," she said aloud, and then she went back to making dinner. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. Charles Benton never made a public statement. He didn't write a poem, didn't go on a podcast, didn't send out a carefully worded letter. He didn't need to, because what mattered most had already been said without a single raised voice. Back at his office in Dayton, life returned to normal. Maggie resumed coordinating routes. Farmers called to ask about upcoming orders. Students kept sending emails after watching his talk from the Sustainability Summit. Charles answered when he could, listened when it mattered, and true to form, stayed off stage when the cameras started looking his way. The photo from Gate 17, the one of him standing calm, phone in hand, quietly made its rounds. It appeared in boardrooms and HR training sessions, even in a slideshow at a logistics conference in Chicago. People used it as an example of something you can't always teach: grace under pressure, presence without spectacle, dignity that doesn't shout. And while Charles may never know all the ways that moment touched others, it changed things in places he may never step foot again. Somewhere in an airport terminal, a gate agent now pauses before assuming. Somewhere in a boardroom, an executive rewrites the way they train their staff. And somewhere in a family kitchen, someone quietly says, "I want to carry myself like that." The world often tells us to be louder, sharper, faster, to fight for our place with noise. But sometimes it's the stillness that speaks loudest. Charles Benton didn't demand respect, he embodied it. And in doing so, he reminded us that real strength isn't about how much space you take up, but how deeply you're rooted when others try to move you. That's not just a story about race or business or travel. It's a story about all of us, about the choices we make when we're looked at like we don't belong, and the power we hold in how we choose to respond. If this story stayed with you, I'd be honored to hear what you thought. You're welcome to share your reflections, your own stories, or just leave a quiet note in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real stories about people, dignity, and resilience, I invite you to stay with us. No pressure, just a place for voices that matter. Take good care.